I still remember the silence of that house more than anything else, the kind of silence that does not feel peaceful but heavy, like the walls themselves are holding back a truth they are afraid to speak. I used to think my life was ordinary, even stable in a quiet way. A home that looked complete from the outside, routines that repeated every day, and a belief that nothing could really break what had been built over years. My husband would leave in the evenings, always saying the same thing in different words. That work had become heavier, that responsibilities had increased, that returning late was just part of surviving in a demanding world. And I, like someone trained to trust, would nod and accept it, even when something deep inside me sometimes felt uncomfortable without reason. At first, I ignored that feeling. I told myself that every marriage has phases of distance, that tiredness can change a person, that providing for a family sometimes takes away presence but not love. I believed in explanations because believing was easier than questioning. And in that belief, I continued my days, taking care of my home, my child, and the small responsibilities that filled every corner of my life. My child was my comfort, my quiet joy, the only part of life that felt honest without effort. When he laughed, I felt like nothing in the world could truly harm us. But slowly, without warning, small cracks began to appear in the pattern I thought was unbreakable. Late returns became later. Phone calls became shorter. Conversations became mechanical. Sometimes, when I would ask about the day, I would get answers that sounded rehearsed, as if they had been repeated too many times to feel real anymore. Still, I convinced myself that suspicion was a dangerous thing, that it could destroy peace even when nothing was wrong. So I stayed quiet. I learned to swallow questions before they became words. There were nights when I would sit near the window long after everyone had fallen asleep, watching the empty street outside, wondering why my heart felt restless without reason. It was not a loud feeling. It was subtle, like something slowly shifting out of place. But I had no proof, no reason strong enough to justify doubt. And in a world where trust is the foundation of everything, I held on to trust even when it began to feel heavy. My child, however, saw the world differently. He did not carry adult patience or adult blindness. He observed everything with a kind of honesty that children naturally possess. At first, I did not notice how carefully he watched. I thought he was simply growing, becoming curious about the world around him. But later I understood that children do not just see actions, they feel patterns. And patterns, once noticed, are hard to unsee. There was a certain evening that began like all others. The house was calm, dinner was simple, and the routine was familiar. My husband left earlier than usual that day, mentioning an urgent task. I remember standing at the doorway watching him leave, feeling nothing unusual at that moment except a mild emptiness I had grown used to. My child sat nearby, quietly playing, but his eyes briefly followed the direction my husband had gone. I did not think much of it then. As the evening deepened, something strange happened. My child became unusually quiet, not the peaceful quiet of tiredness, but a thoughtful silence. He was observing, thinking, processing something I could not yet understand. I asked him if he was fine, and he nodded, but his expression carried something I had never seen before. It was not confusion. It was realization forming slowly. Later that night, while I was busy in another room, I heard him moving around more than usual. Small footsteps, pauses, then movement again. I called out to him, but he responded casually, saying he was just playing. I believed him because that is what mothers do. They believe their children even when something feels slightly different. But something had already changed in him that day. I did not know then that the foundation of my life was about to shift, not through confrontation, not through accusation, but through the quiet observation of a child who had seen something he was never meant to understand so early. And that night, without me realizing it, the first piece of truth had already been uncovered. The night after that quiet evening did not feel different at first. Everything continued as if the world had no reason to shift. The same walls, the same familiar sounds, the same routine of waiting. My husband returned later than usual again, stepping inside with the same tired expression he had started wearing more often. He avoided unnecessary conversation, as if words themselves required energy he no longer wanted to spend. I noticed, but I did not confront. Silence had slowly become a habit between us, and habits are difficult to break when you do not know where the breaking point should be. My child, however, behaved differently. He greeted his father like always, but there was something measured in his voice, something thoughtful, as if he was testing not just presence but intention. I thought it was imagination. Children sometimes mimic adults without understanding. But now, looking back, I realize it was not imitation. It was awareness forming quietly. Days began to pass in a similar pattern. Morning routines, evening departures, late returns. A cycle that looked normal from a distance but felt slightly off when lived closely. I started noticing small inconsistencies, not enough to accuse, but enough to disturb. A smell that did not match his explanation. A delay that seemed longer than necessary. A tiredness that looked different from work exhaustion. But every time I tried to shape those thoughts into something solid, I stopped myself. Doubt, once allowed entry, rarely leaves peacefully. My child started asking questions, subtle ones at first. Why certain days felt longer than others. Why some phone calls made him leave the room. Why he sometimes forgot small promises. I answered gently, always defending the idea that adults carry responsibilities children may not understand yet. He listened, but he did not fully accept those answers the way children usually do. Instead, he began watching more than asking. One afternoon, something changed the rhythm of everything. It was an ordinary day, or it was supposed to be. My husband left earlier than usual again, mentioning something about meeting someone important. I did not question it. I had stopped questioning by then. But my child watched him leave from the doorway longer than normal. He did not wave. He did not speak. He just observed until the door closed. Later that day, I found him sitting unusually still, holding something in his hands. At first, I thought it was just a toy or object from play. But when I looked closer, I noticed it was something that did not belong in his usual world of innocence. A small item that carried meaning I could not immediately understand. He did not hide it. He did not present it either. He simply held it like something he had been trying to understand for a long time. When I asked him about it, he hesitated. That hesitation alone was enough to make my heart slow. Children hesitate only when they are unsure whether truth will be accepted or punished. He finally spoke, not in detail, but enough to make me pause completely. He mentioned seeing something earlier, something he was not supposed to see, something that did not match the story we had been living. I felt a strange discomfort rise inside me, not anger, not denial, but something closer to fear mixed with confusion. I asked him to explain, gently at first, then more carefully. But children do not always explain in direct ways. They describe fragments, moments, images that adults must piece together. And as he spoke, those fragments began forming a shape I was not ready to recognize. I told myself not to jump to conclusions. I told myself children misunderstand things all the time, but my child was not describing imagination. He was describing patterns, timing, places, repeated behavior that did not align with what I had been told. And the more he spoke, the more silence filled the space around us. That night, after he slept, I remained awake for a long time. For the first time, I did not try to defend the explanations I had been holding on to. I simply listened to the absence of certainty inside me. Every sound in the house felt sharper, every movement outside the window felt heavier. I began noticing things I had ignored before. The way he checked his phone more than necessary. The way he avoided certain questions. The way his expressions changed too quickly when interrupted unexpectedly. Still, I did not confront him. Not yet. Because confrontation requires courage and courage requires clarity. And I did not have clarity. But something inside me had already begun shifting. Quietly, irreversibly. And I realized, sitting alone in that still house, that sometimes truth does not arrive loudly. Sometimes it enters through the eyes of someone innocent enough to not understand consequences, but observant enough to notice everything that adults try to hide. And that realization was only the beginning of what my child had already started uncovering. The next days felt heavier, not because anything had openly changed, but because I could no longer ignore the way my mind had started noticing details it once passed over without thought. It is strange how once a single doubt enters a place of trust, everything begins to look slightly different, even when nothing has physically changed. The same home, the same routines, the same faces, but a different feeling behind it all. My child had become quieter than before, not in a sad way, but in a thinking way. He was no longer just living in moments, he was studying them. I noticed how he watched the timing of departures, how he paid attention to small habits, how he remembered things I myself had forgotten. Children usually forget quickly, but he was remembering too much. That is what worried me the most. I tried to distract myself with daily responsibilities. Hopping normal life would pull me back into comfort. Cooking, cleaning, arranging things, speaking softly to maintain peace inside the home. But even while doing all of that, my thoughts kept drifting back to what my child had said earlier. I did not want to believe that a child's observation could shake something so deeply built, but at the same time, I could not fully erase what I had heard. My husband continued his routine. Work, late nights, tired returns. But now I noticed the pauses more clearly, the slight hesitation before answering certain questions, the way his attention would shift when something unexpected came up. Before, I would have ignored these details. Now, they stayed with me longer than they should. One evening, something happened that made everything feel even more uncertain. My child came to me with a question, but not like before. This time, it was careful. He asked if it was normal for someone to say one thing and act differently somewhere else. He did not accuse anyone directly, but his question carried weight that a child should not normally carry. I asked him gently what he meant, but he looked away instead of answering directly. That silence from him felt louder than words. Later that same day, I noticed him standing near the entrance for a long time, watching the outside as if waiting for something or someone. When I asked him what he was doing, he simply said he was thinking. But his eyes were not the eyes of a child thinking about play or school. They were focused, searching, trying to connect something invisible. That night, I could not sleep. My mind kept returning to small moments I had dismissed before. The phone calls that stopped when I entered the room. The way conversations ended too quickly. The way explanations sometimes sounded complete, but still felt incomplete. I started wondering if I had been trusting too easily, or if I had simply chosen not to look deeper because looking deeper would require facing something I was not ready for. My child's behavior was now no longer something I could ignore. He was carrying something inside him, something he had not fully shared yet. And I could feel that whatever he had seen or understood, it was not small enough to remain hidden for long. The next morning, he did something unexpected. While I was busy in another room, he brought something to me again, something he had been carefully keeping. This time, he did not hesitate as much. He placed it near me without explanation at first. When I looked at it, I felt a sudden confusion, not because of what it was exactly, but because of what it represented. It was linked to a place, a moment, something I had never been told about. When I asked him where he got it from, he looked at me with an expression that was too serious for his age. He said he had seen it before in a situation that did not match what we had been told. His words were simple, but their meaning was not. He was connecting pieces that adults often separate intentionally or unintentionally. I felt my throat tighten, not because I understood everything, but because I realized I was no longer the only one living in uncertainty. My child had stepped into it too. I told him softly that sometimes things can be misunderstood, that we should not jump to conclusions. But even as I said it, I could feel my own words losing strength. Because deep down, I was no longer completely convinced by them either. That night, I watched my husband more carefully than before. Not openly, not obviously, but quietly, as if I was trying to see something hidden beneath normal behavior. And for the first time, I felt a distance I could not explain clearly. Not physical distance, but emotional distance that had been growing slowly without my awareness. And in that growing distance, I realized something uncomfortable. My child was no longer just observing life. He was uncovering it. And what he was uncovering was something I had not yet dared to face. The following days carried a tension that did not announce itself loudly, but stayed present in everything. It was in the way mornings began slightly heavier, in the way evenings felt longer, and in the way I found myself thinking twice before accepting simple explanations. Life was still moving in its usual pattern, but my awareness of it had changed, and once awareness changes, nothing feels entirely the same again. My child had now developed a habit of observing quietly before speaking. He would sit in silence longer than before, watching small details that adults often overlook. I noticed how he paid attention to sounds outside the house, how he reacted when a door opened unexpectedly, how he paused before answering even simple questions. It was as if he was building a picture inside his mind, piece by piece, without telling me what the final image was. I tried to act normal for his sake and for mine. I did not want him to feel that something was wrong unless I was certain something was wrong. But children sense emotional shifts even when words remain unchanged. He could feel that I was no longer fully at ease, even if I tried to hide it behind routine behavior. One afternoon, something subtle happened that stayed with me longer than expected. My husband returned earlier than usual, which itself felt slightly unusual after so many late nights. He seemed distracted, not tired in the usual sense, but mentally somewhere else. He spoke less than normal and avoided staying in one place for too long. I observed quietly, telling myself not to attach meaning to everything, but my mind no longer stayed calm as easily as before. My child also noticed his arrival differently. He did not run or speak immediately like he used to. Instead, he watched from a distance, studying reactions rather than expressing excitement. That small change in behavior felt significant, though I could not fully explain why. Later that day, I found my child drawing something on a piece of paper. At first, I thought it was a normal drawing, but when I looked closely, I realized it was not random. It was structured in a way that showed memory, observation, and repetition. He had drawn scenes, not perfectly, but clearly based on things he had seen or believed he had seen. I asked him gently what it was, and he paused before answering. His explanation was simple, but it carried weight. He said he was trying to understand patterns. That word stayed in my mind. Patterns. It is easy to ignore a single event. It is harder to ignore repetition. I asked him where he had seen what he was drawing, but he hesitated again. That hesitation told me more than his words could. It told me that what he had witnessed was not something he fully understood himself, but something that had left an impression strong enough to stay. That night, I could not ignore the growing discomfort inside me. I tried to convince myself that children often mix imagination with reality, that drawings are not proof, that thoughts can form from misunderstandings. But my mind was no longer accepting comfort easily. My husband left again that evening, earlier than expected. He did not explain much, only mentioned something brief before leaving. I watched him go from the doorway, and this time I did not immediately turn away. I stayed there longer than usual, as if trying to notice something I had missed before. My child stood beside me quietly. He did not speak, but his presence felt different. It was as if he was waiting for something to confirm what he already suspected. After my husband left, my child suddenly asked a question that surprised me. It was not about where he was going, but about whether I trusted what I saw or what I was told. It was a simple question, but it did not feel simple when it was asked. I did not answer immediately because I did not have a clear answer. That silence between us became meaningful. Later that night, I found myself unable to sleep again. My thoughts kept returning to small inconsistencies, small moments that I had previously ignored. I began to understand something uncomfortable. Sometimes truth does not arrive as one big moment. It arrives slowly, through fragments that only start making sense when you finally stop avoiding them. And in those fragments, my child was already ahead of me, seeing things I had not yet fully allowed myself to see. The morning after that restless night felt different, not because anything had visibly changed, but because my mind had started waking up with thoughts already waiting for me. It is a strange feeling when your first moments of consciousness are no longer peaceful, but filled with questions you did not fully resolve the night before. I moved through the morning routine quietly, trying to maintain normality, but normality no longer felt as effortless as it once did. My child woke up earlier than usual that day. I noticed him sitting for a long time without speaking, as if he was already thinking before fully entering the day. He was no longer asking random questions or speaking in fragments only. Now his silence itself felt structured, as if he was organizing what he had already observed into something clearer inside his mind. I tried to speak to him gently, to bring him back into the simplicity of childhood, but he responded in a way that surprised me again. He did not resist, but he also did not fully return to that simplicity. Instead, he answered carefully, as if measuring every word before saying it. That kind of behavior is not natural for a child unless something has forced them into awareness beyond their age. Later that morning, something happened that made the atmosphere feel even more unsettled. My husband returned briefly during an unusual time, only to collect something he had forgotten. His presence in the house was short, but not relaxed. He seemed more guarded than before, as if even small environments required caution. I watched him closely, but I did not ask questions. I had started to realize that asking questions too soon sometimes closes doors that are still in the process of opening. My child also observed this return carefully. He did not approach him directly. Instead, he stayed slightly behind, watching actions instead of interaction. When my husband left again, there was a moment of silence that felt heavier than normal. My child turned to me briefly, but said nothing. That silence between us was no longer empty. It felt full of unspoken understanding that neither of us had fully confirmed yet. In the afternoon, my child brought something else to me. This time, it was not a drawing or an object alone, but a series of small observations he had written down in his own way. Not fully structured like an adult record, but consistent enough to show memory and repetition. He had noted times, moments, and small details that he believed were connected. When I looked at it, I felt a tightening inside my chest because it was no longer just observation. It was pattern recognition. He looked at me while I was reading it, not expecting a reaction, but watching for one. That alone made me realize he was no longer just sharing thoughts. He was testing understanding. I asked him softly how he started noticing all of this. He paused for a long time before answering, and when he did, his answer was not emotional or exaggerated. It was calm, almost too calm. He said he began noticing when things he was told did not always match what he saw. That simple sentence carried more weight than anything dramatic could have. I did not respond immediately. I felt a mixture of emotions I could not separate easily. Confusion, concern, and something deeper that I did not want to name yet. That evening, I found myself paying attention to everything more than I ever had before. The way doors closed, the timing of movements, the tone of simple conversations. Everything felt like it could contain meaning I had previously ignored. And with that shift in attention, I began noticing things I had not seen before, even in my own understanding of daily life. My husband's absence that night felt longer than usual, even if it was not significantly different in time. But perception had changed. What once felt normal now felt stretched. And in that stretch of time, my mind kept returning to my child's words, his observations, his quiet certainty growing with each passing day. When my husband finally returned late at night, I did not immediately react. I simply observed. And for the first time, I noticed something that I had not allowed myself to fully acknowledge before. The distance between what was said and what was felt was becoming harder to ignore. My child stood near the hallway that night, watching quietly again, and I realized something I had been avoiding. This was no longer just confusion inside my mind. It was becoming something that both of us, mother and child, were beginning to see from different angles, slowly approaching the same hidden truth without yet having the full courage to name it. The next part of my life began to feel like I was living inside a quiet investigation I never agreed to start, yet could no longer stop. Every ordinary moment now seemed to carry a second layer beneath it, something hidden that I could sense but not fully define. I no longer trusted the ease I once lived in, because ease now felt like ignorance, and ignorance no longer felt safe. My child had changed in a way that could not be ignored anymore. He was still small in body, still innocent in appearance, but his mind was no longer resting in innocence alone. He would sit quietly for long periods, sometimes staring at nothing, sometimes replaying moments in his head like someone trying to solve a puzzle without all the pieces. I noticed how he reacted less emotionally now and more analytically, as if feelings had temporarily taken a backseat to understanding. I tried to bring normal conversations back into our space, asking him about simple things, about food, about play, about his day. He responded, but not with the same energy as before. His answers were short, thoughtful, and often followed by silence. That silence was no longer empty. It felt like processing. One afternoon, I found him sitting near the window again, watching the outside world with unusual focus. He told me he was trying to understand timing. That word again. Timing. I asked him what he meant, and he explained in fragments that he was noticing when certain things happened and how they repeated in ways that did not feel random to him. He said it like a simple observation, not an accusation, but the meaning behind it felt much heavier. I did not interrupt him. I just listened. And as I listened, I realized something uncomfortable was forming in me too. Not a conclusion, but awareness. A slow realization that patterns do not become patterns unless they repeat often enough to be recognized. And once recognized, they cannot be unseen. That evening, my husband left again at the usual time, but something about the moment felt different even before he stepped outside. There was a slight hesitation in his movement, a brief pause before leaving, as if something was weighing on him. I noticed it, but I did not ask. I was learning that sometimes questions only delay truth instead of revealing it. My child watched him leave from a slightly different angle this time, not standing close to me but a little apart, as if trying to observe without influence. After the door closed, he remained still for a long moment. Then he turned to me and asked something that stayed with me deeply. He asked if people always tell the same truth in the same way. It was not a simple question. It was layered. I did not answer immediately because I did not know how to answer honestly without making everything heavier than it already was. That night, I found myself unable to engage in any normal activity. Even simple tasks felt disconnected from my mind. I kept thinking about what my child had been observing, about how he had started connecting things I had never paid attention to before. And I began wondering if I had been avoiding noticing things not because they were invisible, but because they were uncomfortable to acknowledge. Later, something small but significant happened. While organizing things in the house, I came across something I had not expected to find in a familiar place. It was not dramatic on its own, but its presence felt out of alignment with what I believed to be true about our daily life. I held it for a moment without fully understanding why it felt important, but something inside me reacted before logic could. When my child saw it, his reaction was immediate but controlled. He did not speak loudly or dramatically. He simply looked at it, then looked at me, as if confirming something he had already been suspecting. That look stayed with me longer than any explanation could have. I told myself again that I should not rush to conclusions, that understanding takes time, that fragments do not always form a complete picture. But even as I told myself that, I could feel the structure of my certainty weakening slowly. That night, my husband returned later than usual again, and when he entered, I noticed something I had not paid attention to before in such clarity. The way he carried himself was not just tired, it was guarded, like someone who was aware of being observed more closely than before. My child stood at a distance again, but this time his silence felt sharper, more focused. Not confused anymore, but attentive. And in that moment, I realized something quietly unsettling. We were no longer just living in uncertainty. We were moving closer to something that had already been unfolding long before we noticed it. That night, after my husband finally settled, and the house fell into its usual late silence, I found myself unable to return to the comfort of sleep. It was not insomnia in the usual sense, but something heavier, like my mind refusing to disconnect from thoughts that had started forming their own presence inside me. Every sound in the house felt sharper than it should have. Every movement outside the window felt like it carried meaning. I was no longer ignoring. My child was asleep, but even in his sleep, he looked different to me now. Not disturbed, not troubled in a visible way, but carrying the quiet weight of someone who has started understanding more than they are supposed to at their age. I stood near him for a long time that night, just watching his calm face, wondering when exactly innocence had started shifting into awareness. The morning after that restless night did not bring relief. Instead, it carried continuation. Continuation of thoughts, continuation of observation, continuation of something I could no longer define as normal. My child woke up earlier again, and the first thing he did was not speak, not eat, not play, but sit quietly as if resuming something he had left unfinished in his mind. I asked him if he was feeling okay, and he nodded, but his nod was no longer enough to reassure me. There was something in his eyes now, a kind of steady focus that did not belong to childhood confusion anymore. It belonged to understanding forming slowly, carefully, and without permission from the world around him. He asked me something small that morning, but the question stayed with me for a long time. He asked if people always behave the same when they think no one is watching. It sounded simple, but it was not. It carried observation, repetition, and memory behind it. I tried to answer gently, saying that people are not always the same, that behavior can change depending on situations. But even as I said it, I felt like my words were no longer fully reaching him in the same way they used to. Later that day, I noticed him standing near the same spot again, the place where he often observed the outside world. But this time, his focus was sharper. He was not just watching anymore. He was timing, measuring, comparing. I could not see exactly what he was thinking, but I could feel that his mind was connecting things faster than mine now. That afternoon, something shifted again in a way that I could not ignore anymore. My husband returned home earlier than expected, but not in his usual calm manner. There was a visible tension in him, subtle but present. He moved through the house differently, as if aware that something around him had changed. I noticed how his eyes briefly scanned the surroundings more than before, how he paused slightly before speaking. I did not ask anything. I simply observed. My child, however, observed differently. He did not approach, did not react openly. He just watched. And in that watching, I realized he was no longer just collecting moments. He was building understanding from them. Later, while I was occupied elsewhere, my child came to me with something again. This time, it was not just an object or a drawing. It was a sequence, a structure. He had arranged his observations in a way that showed progression, not randomness. He pointed at certain parts quietly, not to accuse, not to explain dramatically, but to show continuity. As if he was saying, this connects to that and that connects to this. I felt something inside me tighten, not from fear exactly, but from realization slowly forming without my permission. I asked him where he learned to think this way, and he simply said he was watching carefully because things did not always match what was said. That sentence was simple, but it carried a depth I could no longer dismiss easily. That evening, I began noticing everything again with a different awareness. Small gaps in time, small inconsistencies in behavior, slight changes in tone. Things I had ignored before were now becoming visible without effort, and once seen, they could not be unseen. My husband left again that night, and this time I noticed something I had not paid attention to earlier. Not what he said, but what he avoided saying. Not what he did, but what he did not do. Absence itself had started speaking louder than presence. My child stood near the doorway after he left, silent as always now, but more centered than confused. And I realized something slowly settling in my mind. We were both watching the same life now, but from two different levels of understanding. And whatever was being uncovered was no longer only his discovery or my doubt. It was becoming something that was slowly demanding to be faced. The days after that began to feel like they were folding into each other without clear separation. Morning no longer felt distinct from evening, and evening no longer felt like closure. Everything blended into a continuous stretch of awareness, where I was constantly noticing, constantly thinking, constantly trying to understand what I had once accepted without question. My child had become even more quiet, but not in a withdrawn way. It was the quiet of someone who is deeply engaged with thought. He no longer asked many questions outwardly. Instead, he seemed to ask them inwardly, as if every moment was being measured against something he already knew but had not yet fully expressed. I started observing him more carefully now, not out of suspicion, but out of a growing need to understand what he understood. There is a strange shift that happens when a child begins to see patterns before the adult does. The adult becomes the one trying to catch up, trying to interpret what the child has already quietly processed. One morning, I noticed him sitting with a small sense of urgency in his stillness. He was not restless, but focused. His gaze kept returning to the same directions, the same timings, as if he was confirming something internally. When I asked him if something was bothering him, he shook his head slightly, but his expression did not fully agree with that denial. He told me he was just thinking again, but this time, thinking felt like a different word than before. Later that day, I noticed something unusual in the rhythm of our home. Small inconsistencies I had not paid attention to before started standing out more clearly. Not dramatic changes, but subtle ones. The kind of details that normally pass unnoticed because life does not usually demand such close attention. But once attention is forced, even unintentionally, everything begins to look structured in a different way. My husband was still following his routine, but now I was no longer seeing it as a routine. I was seeing gaps inside it. Gaps in timing, gaps in explanation, gaps in presence. And my mind, once it started filling those gaps with questions, did not stop easily. My child, however, was not filling gaps with questions. He was filling them with observation. That afternoon, he came to me again with something he had arranged. This time, it was not random notes or scattered thoughts. It had structure. He had grouped events together in a way that suggested comparison. Not emotional comparison, but logical sequencing. He showed me how certain moments seemed to repeat in patterns that were not immediately obvious unless looked at closely. I tried to stay calm while looking at it, but inside, something was shifting. Not panic, not shock, but recognition of something slowly becoming undeniable. I asked him why he was so focused on this, and he replied in a way that stayed with me longer than expected. He said that when things repeat without reason, it usually means there is a reason not being seen clearly yet. It was said simply, without accusation, without anger, just observation. But it carried a depth that felt heavier than his age should allow. That evening, I found myself watching everything more closely again. Not just my husband, but time itself. The way hours passed. The way small actions repeated. The way conversations ended slightly too neatly, as if avoiding continuation. And for the first time, I began to feel something I had not allowed myself to feel before. Not certainty, but alignment. As if different small pieces of life were slowly beginning to align into a shape I was not yet fully willing to recognize. My husband returned later than usual again that night, but what struck me was not the timing. It was the way he entered, slightly more controlled than before, as if even entering his own home required awareness now. He did not immediately speak or relax. He paused briefly, scanning, assessing, then continued as if mentally adjusting. My child noticed it too. I saw it in the way his eyes followed the movement quietly, not reacting outwardly, but recording inwardly. That night, after everything had settled, I found myself sitting alone longer than usual. I tried to convince myself that maybe I was reading too much into things, that stress can create patterns where none exist. But deep down, I knew something different was happening. Because children do not usually build structured observations out of nothing. And my child was not imagining randomness anymore. He was recognizing repetition. And repetition, once recognized clearly enough, does not stay silent for long. That was the night I understood something I had been resisting until then. We were no longer in the stage of confusion. We were in the stage of nearing understanding. The morning after that realization did not feel lighter, even though nothing outwardly had changed. It felt as if my mind had simply crossed a threshold it could no longer step back from. Once you begin to see structure inside what you once called normal, it becomes difficult to return to blindness, even if that blindness once felt like peace. My child woke up unusually early again, but this time there was something different in his calmness. It was not just observation anymore. It was certainty forming slowly. He was no longer just collecting moments, he was interpreting them. And interpretation, once it begins, is no longer passive. He sat near me for a while without speaking, and I could feel that he was thinking about something he had not yet shared. I did not rush him. I had learned that forcing words too early only closes doors that are still opening inside someone's mind. After some time, he spoke, Not about something new, but about something continuous. He mentioned that when he connects all the things he has been noticing, they do not feel separate anymore. They feel like they belong to the same line, the same direction. He said it without emotion, but with clarity. That clarity made me uncomfortable in a way I could not immediately explain. I tried to respond carefully, asking him if he was sure about what he was seeing. He did not say yes or no directly. Instead, he said that patterns do not require belief, they only require repetition to be noticed. That sentence stayed with me longer than I expected. Later that day, I found myself more alert than usual, even in small actions. I noticed timing again. I noticed pauses again. I noticed how conversations sometimes ended right before something deeper could be asked. Everything started feeling like it had edges I had previously ignored. My husband continued his routine, but now I could no longer see it as simple routine. I began noticing how certain behaviors aligned with specific times, how certain absences followed predictable gaps, how explanations sometimes arrived too quickly without natural buildup. None of these things were dramatic individually, but together they created a growing sense of structure that I could not ignore. My child, however, was not overwhelmed by it. He was focused, quietly focused, as if he had accepted that understanding requires patience and patience requires observation over time. That afternoon, he showed me something again. This time, it was more organized than before. He had started linking his earlier observations into a sequence that showed continuity over days, not just isolated events. He pointed out how certain actions seemed to repeat under similar conditions, and how certain explanations seemed to appear at similar moments. I listened carefully, but inside me, something was shifting. Not toward panic, but toward acknowledgement that something real was being seen, even if I was not yet fully ready to define it. I asked him if he felt afraid while thinking about all of this. He paused for a moment before answering. He said he did not feel afraid because fear usually comes from not understanding something, but he felt something else instead: awareness. That word felt heavier than fear. That evening, I noticed something I had not consciously observed before. The way my husband sometimes checked surroundings before speaking. The way he occasionally paused before answering simple questions. The way certain conversations seemed to be guided away from deeper directions without being obvious about it. I did not confront him. I did not ask questions. I simply observed, like my child was doing, but from a different level of understanding. And for the first time, I felt the distance between what I had believed and what I was beginning to see slowly narrowing. Not completely clear yet, but no longer invisible. That night, when everything became quiet again, I realized something that settled deeply inside me. Truth does not usually arrive as one moment. It arrives as alignment. And alignment was now happening slowly, through observation, through repetition, through the eyes of a child who had started noticing what adults often train themselves not to see. And I was no longer outside that process. I was inside it now. The next phase did not feel like discovery anymore. It felt like continuation of something already in motion long before I became aware of it. My mind no longer resisted the idea that patterns were real. Instead, it began focusing on their structure, their consistency, their meaning. I was no longer asking whether something was happening. I was slowly starting to ask what exactly was happening. My child had become even more composed in his behavior. There was no excitement in his observations, no emotional reaction, only steady attention. It is difficult to describe how unsettling calm understanding can be in a child. He was not confused anymore. He was not guessing anymore. He was observing with a kind of clarity that made silence itself feel meaningful. He began speaking less, but when he did speak, his words were direct. He no longer described isolated incidents. He described connections. He would mention one moment and immediately link it to another without hesitation, as if the distance between them had already been measured in his mind long ago. I started noticing that I was now following him mentally, trying to understand the same structure he was seeing. This shift was subtle but powerful. Instead of him asking me questions, I was now internally trying to understand his conclusions. That afternoon, something changed slightly in the rhythm of the house again. My husband returned briefly, but there was less engagement than before. He seemed preoccupied, more inwardly focused. Even when he spoke, it felt like his attention was partially elsewhere. I noticed how he did not linger in rooms longer than necessary anymore, as if minimizing exposure without consciously announcing it. My child observed this without moving closer or reacting. He simply watched, as if confirming something internally. I realized then that he no longer needed new information in the same way. He was now validating what he already believed he understood. Later that day, he came to me again with a quiet seriousness. This time, he did not bring objects or drawings. He brought conclusion fragments, small statements that, when placed together, formed something more complete than before. He explained that certain actions seemed to follow predictable cycles, that certain explanations were repeated in ways that matched previous explanations. That timing itself seemed to be part of the pattern. As he spoke, I felt something inside me tighten again. Not fear exactly, but recognition that what he was describing was no longer isolated imagination. It had structure, repetition, logic built from observation. I tried asking him again if he might be misunderstanding something, but he responded calmly, almost gently, saying that misunderstanding usually happens when you look at one piece instead of many. That sentence stayed in my mind for the rest of the day. That evening, I found myself observing my husband differently, not emotionally, but structurally. I was no longer reacting to behavior, I was mapping it. I noticed timing gaps more clearly now. I noticed consistency in absence. I noticed how certain explanations followed similar patterns when questioned indirectly. And what surprised me most was not what I saw, but how easily I started seeing it once I stopped resisting. My child stood beside me quietly at one point, not speaking, just present. And in that shared silence, I realized something important. We were no longer interpreting differently. We were beginning to interpret the same way, just at different speeds. That night, after everything had settled again, I felt a shift inside me that was no longer reversible. I was no longer holding onto uncertainty as protection. I was beginning to move toward clarity, even if clarity was not fully formed yet. And I understood something deeply uncomfortable, but undeniable. What my child had started noticing was not a single truth being revealed. It was a system of truth, slowly connecting themselves. And I was now part of that connection. The weight of understanding does not always arrive like a sudden moment. Sometimes it settles slowly, like dust after movement, becoming visible only when everything else grows still enough to notice it. That is what my life had started feeling like now. Something settling, forming, becoming impossible to ignore. My child no longer behaved like someone discovering something. He behaved like someone confirming what had already been partially understood. There was a calm certainty in him that made even his silence feel structured. He did not rush to speak anymore. He spoke only when something aligned internally, as if words were now outcomes rather than questions. I found myself increasingly watching him instead of only watching my surroundings. Not because he was wrong, but because I was trying to understand how he had reached a level of clarity I was still struggling to define. It is a strange reversal when a mother begins to learn observation from her child, not through teaching, but through necessity. That day passed with a strange stillness. My husband followed his routine again, but everything about his presence now felt slightly more contained, less open, more controlled. It was not dramatic, but it was noticeable, and once noticeable, it could no longer be ignored. My child did not react to it in the way he used to. There was no surprise, no confusion, only recognition. I saw him register the moment internally and then move on, as if it was another piece confirming what he already understood. Later, he spoke to me again, but this time his words were fewer and heavier. He said that when something repeats long enough, it stops being coincidence and starts becoming structure. He did not say it with emotion, but with certainty that did not need validation. I did not argue with him. I could not, because I had started noticing the same repetition too. That evening, I found myself thinking less about what might be happening and more about what had already been happening for a long time without my full awareness. The realization was uncomfortable, not because it was loud, but because it was quiet and consistent. It did not shock me. It aligned. My husband returned again later than expected, and I noticed something different in how I observed him. I was no longer trying to interpret his words. I was observing pauses between his words. I was observing transitions between actions. I was observing what was not being said. And in that observation, I began to understand something slowly forming underneath everything. There was a structure to what had once felt random. My child stood near me again that night, not speaking, just present. And in his presence, I realized something I had been avoiding naming fully. He was no longer just seeing fragments. He was seeing continuity. And I was now close enough to see it too. That night, after everything became quiet, I sat for a long time without moving. Not because I was waiting for something new, but because I finally understood that I was no longer at the beginning of understanding. I was in the middle of it. And whatever truth was forming, it was no longer hidden in isolated moments. It was forming itself through repetition, through behavior, through time. And the most unsettling part was not what it might be. It was how long it had already been happening before I noticed. The final stage of realization did not come with noise or confrontation. It came with stillness, a kind of stillness that no longer felt like peace, but like completion of something that had been building for a long time without my full awareness. By now, I no longer questioned whether patterns existed. I no longer debated with my own thoughts. Everything I had observed, everything my child had shown me, everything I had slowly begun to notice myself had already formed a direction. And once direction becomes visible, denial stops being comfort and starts becoming avoidance. My child was no longer uncertain in any way. He moved through each day with calm understanding, not excitement, not fear, but settled awareness. He did not ask me many questions anymore because he no longer needed confirmation. He had already moved past guessing and into knowing through observation. That change in him was the clearest sign that something real had been understood, even if I had taken longer to fully reach it. That day, everything felt strangely ordinary on the surface. Routine continued. Movements continued. Conversations happened in their usual shape. But beneath that surface, everything felt different to me now. I was no longer seeing individual moments. I was seeing continuity running through them. My husband followed his usual pattern again, but this time I no longer interpreted it emotionally. I observed it structurally. And in that structure, I could no longer ignore the consistency that had been forming over time. The same behaviors repeating under similar conditions. The same gaps appearing in similar places. The same explanations aligning too neatly with timing that no longer felt random. I did not confront him. I did not create conflict, because by this point, confrontation was no longer the center of understanding. Observation had already done its work. My child stood beside me quietly that evening, and I realized something deeply important in that moment. He was no longer trying to reveal anything to me. He was simply present with what had already been revealed, and I finally was not resisting it anymore. There was no dramatic breaking point, no sudden collapse. Instead, there was acceptance forming slowly, like something settling into place after a long period of uncertainty. And in that acceptance, something inside me became calm for the first time in a long while. Because I understood now that truth does not always destroy life in an instant. Sometimes it corrects it slowly. Sometimes it forces clarity without shouting. Sometimes it arrives through the eyes of a child who has not yet learned to ignore what he sees. And sometimes, the most painful part is not discovering what was hidden. It is realizing how long you were living beside it without knowing. That night, when everything finally became quiet, I did not feel confusion anymore. I felt understanding. And with understanding came a difficult but necessary realization. The life I thought I had been living was not suddenly broken. It had simply been revealed. After that night, nothing in the house changed suddenly, but everything changed in how I experienced it. The next morning arrived like any other morning. Light entered through the same windows, the same sounds moved through the same rooms, and the same routines tried to continue as if nothing had shifted. But I was no longer inside the same version of that routine. I was watching it from a place where awareness had already settled. My child sat beside me quietly, no longer carrying urgency or investigation in his expression. The questions inside him had already transformed into understanding, and understanding does not always need repetition to survive. He was calm in a way that no longer felt like innocence returning, but clarity becoming permanent. There was no confrontation, no dramatic ending, no loud breaking of anything that had once held the shape of normal life. Instead, there was distance, soft, quiet, undeniable. A distance that came from seeing too clearly to return to how things used to feel. My husband continued his routine as well, but I no longer measured it the way I used to. I had stopped searching for hidden meanings in every word and every pause, not because everything had become simple again, but because everything had already been understood as far as it needed to be. What remained was not chaos, not collapse, but consequence. I realized something deeply important in those final days of that chapter of my life. Truth does not always arrive to destroy what exists. Sometimes it arrives to show what has already been happening quietly beneath it for a long time. And when it is finally seen, life does not always end or break, it reorients. Slowly, I began rebuilding my sense of direction, not by returning to what I believed before, but by accepting what I could no longer unsee. My child remained close, but his childhood returned in a different form, not ignorance, but simplicity without confusion. He smiled again, but now it carried awareness instead of blindness. And I learned something I will never forget. Some truths do not come to punish you. They come to make you finally stop living inside uncertainty. And once uncertainty ends, even pain becomes something you can finally understand instead of fear. That is how my story did not end in destruction, but in clarity. The night did not end in chaos, but in a quiet kind of truth that slowly softened everything that had been tight inside me for so long. When everything finally settled, there was no loud confrontation, no breaking point, only a long silence where understanding began to replace confusion. My husband finally spoke that night, not with excuses, not with anger, not with defense, but with a heaviness that felt like honesty finally being carried after being delayed for too long. He admitted that the distance I had been feeling was never meant to hurt anyone, but was the result of pressure, stress, and emotional exhaustion that he had failed to communicate properly. He had chosen silence instead of explanation, not realizing that silence creates its own version of fear in the mind of the person left behind. What I had interpreted as secrecy was, in parts, miscommunication and avoidance, not betrayal. And that realization did not erase everything instantly, but it shifted something deep inside me, the direction of my thoughts, my emotions, and my heart slowly turning away from suspicion and toward understanding. We did not become perfect again in a single moment. Nothing real heals that fast. Trust is not something that returns in one apology or one explanation. It rebuilds slowly, in small actions, in repeated honesty, in consistency that replaces doubt over time. But something important changed that night. We started talking again without fear. Not polished conversations, not defensive arguments, but real, unfinished, human conversations where silence was no longer used as protection. It felt unfamiliar at first, almost uncomfortable, because truth after long silence does not immediately feel peaceful. It feels raw before it feels healing. My child, who had carried too much awareness for his age, finally relaxed in a way I had not seen for a long time. The weight in his silence began to disappear. He was no longer observing like someone trying to decode uncertainty. He was simply present again. And I realized then that what he had sensed as patterns were never deception or hidden betrayal, but fragmented communication between adults who had stopped expressing themselves clearly. He had been reading distance as meaning, repetition as intention, and silence as evidence, because that is how an observing mind tries to understand an unclear world. In the days that followed, there was a slow return of peace. Not the old kind of peace that comes from not questioning anything, but a more conscious peace, the kind that comes after understanding what was actually happening. We began correcting what had been missing for too long: honesty in small things, presence in daily life, attention in conversations that were once rushed or avoided. My husband started opening up about pressure instead of hiding it behind silence, and I started asking instead of assuming. And slowly, the space between misunderstanding and truth began to shrink. I learned something during that time that stayed deeply with me. Silence does not protect relationships. It only delays understanding, and in that delay, fear grows in places where clarity should have been. What we avoid saying does not disappear. It transforms into assumptions in the mind of the other person. And assumptions, once formed, feel like truth even when they are not. My child returned to being a child again, not because he forgot what he observed, but because he no longer had to carry it alone. His innocence did not return as ignorance, but as relief. He could observe the world again without feeling responsible for interpreting it. And I realized that children are not meant to carry adult uncertainty. They reflect it, absorb it, and sometimes misread it, but they should not have to hold it. As time passed, I began to understand the most important lesson of everything we went through. Sometimes what feels like a breaking point is actually a turning point, but only if people are willing to replace distance with truth instead of letting distance grow into assumption. Pain does not always come from what is happening. It often comes from what is not being explained. In the end, nothing dramatic was needed to fix everything. No one had to be destroyed for things to be understood. No perfect apology rewrote the past. What changed was something quieter but far more powerful: perspective. We learned to look at the same life differently, to speak instead of assuming, to listen instead of interpreting silence as meaning. And from that shift, we rebuilt not a perfect life, but a more honest one, where peace did not come from pretending everything was fine, but from finally understanding each other without fear.